How are ya? This is Tommy's Outdoors 70. Yes, nice round number. And I just want to thank you all for being with me for the past 70 episodes. And I hope you enjoyed listening to them as much as I did making them. Today's guest is well known to listeners to the podcast from one of the previous episodes. He is Matt Cross. He is field sports journalist. And it was nice to catch up with Matt and talk about the variety of subjects, including rewilding, the ethics of field sports, and the phasing out of lead shots and lead in general. But before I let you enjoy this episode of Tommy's Outdoors, I would ask you to go to YouTube and subscribe to Tommy's Outdoors YouTube channel. Needless to say, all episodes of the podcast are available there, and some of them are filmed, so you can see me and my guests talking. Not all of them, but some of them. But there's also a vlog and some gear reviews and a commentary. In general, all outdoors people will find there a lot of interesting material. So subscribe to Tommy's Outdoors YouTube channel. And now, without any further ado, ladies and gentlemen, Matt Cross. Matt, welcome back to the show.
Thank you, Tommy. It's nice to be back.
Yes, like last time our podcast was entirely dedicated to illegal killing of hen harriers, and we haven't got into anything else. And on top of that, you were not featured in the title of the podcast. You know, like my titles of the podcast.
Outrageous, Tommy. Outrageous.
Yeah, I know, but you know, on my defense, like the titles of my podcast are following this pattern, you know, something with and the name of my guest. So I didn't want to put like an illegal hen harrier shooting with Matt Cross, because that
that impression, couldn't it?
Yeah, exactly. Listen, but just to pick up where we left and go from there. Has anything changed since we last spoke with regards to raptor persecution and the whole messy situation that we were discussing last time?
Okay, well, there has been one big change in Scotland, which has been the publication of a report called the Werity Report, which was looking at grouse moor management and looking at whether to license grouse moors. And that report was published just before Christmas. And it made a recommendation that basically grouse moors now have, I think, 5 years to demonstrate an improvement in the conservation status of a range of birds of prey, including hen harriers. And if they don't do that within 5 years, then licensing will be introduced. So that has been the big change in Scotland.
Yeah, and am I correct in saying that was a little bit surprising, because the expectation was that the recommendation will be to introduce licensing flat out, and yet there was like given this 5-year period before, you know, we kind of come back to the subject?
Complete surprise. Yes, I mean, as somebody who follows these things very closely, I think we were all expecting the recommendation that a licensing system be introduced. And this whole 5-year probation type period was a complete surprise for everybody. Apart from obviously the people who are on the committee, the rest of us were blindsided by it.
Yeah, but would you say this is like a good development or?
Yes, I think for grouse shooting, I think it's a very good development. I think grouse shooting can chalk that one up as a major success. There's no doubt about it, and it does give people that chance to show that grouse shooting can live alongside birds of prey. So yes, I think it's a good thing.
Listen, I actually should probably start with asking you how, you know, obviously, especially for people who are going to be listening to this podcast, you know, in a few weeks or months' time. We are still in a kind of lockdown situation here due to the COVID thing. How
Yes.
this is impacting field sports, and how, do you see the impact? Did you expecting to be a major impact, or how,
Yes. Yes, I think in the UK it will be a very significant impact. So at the moment, essentially all forms of field sport have stopped. Okay, so there is some essential pest control activity carrying on, because it's lambing time at the moment. So foxes and crows have to be controlled during lambing, where you have problems with fox and crow predation. So that's carrying on. Um, Shooting pigeons and corvids on cereals is carrying on because they can be very damaging to cereals at this time of year. But any kind of sporting activity, like deer stalking, for instance, and fishing, are completely stopped. And I think we all anticipate a very significant disruption to the shooting season when it comes around in October, because really there's a major sort of disruption to the flow of money through the shooting through shooting businesses at the moment. Because what's happening is a lot of people are unsure how much shooting there will be come October when the pheasant season starts, so they're not paying deposits to shoots. Because those shoots aren't getting their deposits, they're not buying birds, which then is knocking right on down through the supply chain. So there will be an ongoing, very, very significant impact from this. Certainly, the shoot that would normally spend a lot of time on in the winter is not going to shoot at all this year.
Yeah, so this is interesting what you said, that they're not buying birds. So would you mind explaining that, especially for listeners who don't know how it works, and then for me as well? So
Sure.
is it like the birds are being bought based on the number of bookings of people who are gonna come back shooting? So there are not like birds who are actually there in the area.
Okay, so there are two models that you can adopt. This is simplification, but essentially there are two models you can adopt if you want to run, say, a driven pheasant shoot. Okay,
Hmm.
the first would be a wild bird model, where what you do is you work with the population of birds that you have on your land, and you manage that population, and then you shoot the surplus on that population. Okay, that traditionally was the way nearly all shooting was done, but that has been completely replaced now with a release-based model, where what you do is essentially you buy in birds, and you can buy them as eggs, you can buy them as day-old chicks, or you can buy them. The typical thing now is to buy them as 7-week-old poults.
Uh-huh.
Um, so you'd buy them in at 7 weeks old. You'd initially put them into pens where they'd be fed and watered, and then you'd release them from those pens several weeks before the shooting season started, and then that's the number of birds you have to shoot.
Hmm.
And you choose the number of birds you're going to buy in, partly certainly based on your bookings, or if it's your own shoot, how many days you want to shoot yourself, um, but also based on the ability of your land to support that number of birds sustainably. Because obviously, if you release, let's say, 10,000 birds, that has an impact, okay? And you have to have enough ground to be able to absorb that impact sustainably. So it's a question of the balance between the economic consideration of how many days you have booked or how many days you plan to shoot, and the environmental consideration of the impact of those bird releases on the land you're shooting on.
Yeah. And is it not the that model and the impact of the birds, is it not the also a kind of subject of the ongoing discussion, and many people being unhappy about that, oh,
Yes,
you
it does.
shouldn't be doing that because you're releasing those pheasants and they have an impact on the environment and all that. What's your view on this, and on the whole challenging that model, because that tightly relates to then kind of like a hunting PR problems that are going on, I think, everywhere.
Yeah, it certainly does. And there is no doubt, I don't think anybody would tell you that you can just release any number of birds without impact. Of course, if you put, as I say 10,000 mouths onto land, that is going to have an impact. They're going to eat vegetation, they're going to eat insects, they're going to have an impact there, no doubt about it. Now, it's a question, though, of balancing positive impacts against negative impacts. Because when you release those birds, yes, they're going to be eating, they're going to be scratching. There are problems with parasites and diseases as well. There's no doubt about that. So there are negative impacts that arise from that. But there are also positive impacts. For me, the most important positive impact is that it incentivizes people to retain good quality habitats. Because
Yeah.
if you've got a big sort of woody, scrubby area on your farm, and all you're doing is farming sheep, well, you've no incentive to retain that. You want to get rid of that, get some grass, get some more sheep on it.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas if you've got a shoot on there, then you can say, well, actually, that makes a great piece of pheasant cover. It makes a great pheasant drive. So we have an incentive to retain it.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's one of the most important things about shooting, is that it provides an incentive to retain high quality habitat. And it also puts a very skilled habitat management and predator management workforce into the countryside in the form of gamekeepers, who are able to manipulate that habitat, suppress very abundant populations of things like carrion crows and foxes, which we have a lot of in the UK, far higher densities those than European averages. So you've got to balance the negative impact of putting thousands of hungry birds onto a piece of ground against the positive impact of maintaining habitats, managing them, providing a skilled workforce that can work with those habitats and with the predators on them. So, yeah, it's not straightforward at all.
And this is something I think I mentioned that before, that perhaps that's where the problem lies, that people are kind of uncomfortable with that the fact of putting something artificially, like in this case pheasant, kind of obscures the fact that then there's an enormous amount of actual natural habitat that is being protected. And obviously then there is an always argument like, yeah, but this habitat is used by those, invasive and non-native pesky pheasants rather than not, native birds and so on and so forth. Is that
It
the
is.
problem?
That's true. But the question is, would that habitat be there at all if it wasn't for the pheasants?
Yes.
Because really, what incentive is there to keep it? People forget that land has to pay in the vast majority of cases. It's somebody's asset and it's their source of income, and it has to pay. So, if you have a snipe shoot, for instance, then you have an incentive to retain boggy, tussocky land that is great for snipe and great for a whole lot of other things as well. Whereas if you didn't have that snipe shoot, then your incentive is to drain that land, turn it into grass, and graze sheep and cattle on it. So, yes, whilst the driver, the primary driver, might be the shooting and might be those non-native birds, actually there's a whole lot of other native wildlife that benefits off the back of those.
Yeah, and I think it's fair to say that we, especially in the context of UK or Scotland, that the landscape has changed so much that there is actually no way of doing that in the other way, or maybe in a short term, right? And I can pivot here into two subjects that I want to talk to you about. One would be a rewilding, and the other one would be this shooting versus hunting kind of, I don't want to say debate, but something that is in my head a lot, because I began approaching this kind of from the naive perspective, and I didn't know people, I didn't know situation. I kind of like staring at it from the distance and took a little bit of a naive approach. Oh, I don't know anything. Now I know. I can't pretend anymore that I don't know people who are involved in all this and campaigning. But to me, like internally, I think that if it was called hunting, not shooting, that would be much, much easier to swallow, because, you go on a hunt and you don't know what you're going to shoot, and you don't actually, there's an unknown.
Sure.
While when you're calling shooting, like to me, shooting is, I take my target paper targets and go on the range and I'm shooting. And this is kind of like a mixture of two. It's it's shooting, but it's also hunting, but it's hunting with like a certainty because, like you said, you're paying for birds or something like that. So then hardcore hunter will ask a question, is this really hunting? Actually, that's shooting. So the name is correct. And that's where you have the, let's say, animal loving crowd coming in with the arguments, oh, it's inhumane, it's this and that and something else.
Okay, well, the first thing is there's a peculiar quirk of language in the UK about the term hunting.
Yeah, please explain, especially to me as a non-native speaker. So
okay, so particularly within the field sports community in the UK, hunting refers specifically to hunting foxes with hounds. Okay, so if I was to turn around to a friend, you know, who shoots or whatever, and I said I'm going hunting this weekend, what they would understand that to mean is that I was going to go and chase foxes with hounds.
Okay, not go and shooting deer or anything like that. It's specific.
No, you see, because we wouldn't call that hunting; we would call that stalking. So we have a very odd set of language around this, which is completely out of sync with the rest of the world. Because an American would call what we do, you know, with pheasants, hunting. And in fact, I know quite well a chap who runs a company called Pheasant Hunting Scotland because he markets to Americans. So he can't call it Pheasant Shooting Scotland. That's meaningless to Americans. He calls it Pheasant Hunting Scotland. But to the Scottish ear, that sounds very odd. Pheasant hunting just doesn't sound right. So there is partly a sort of linguistic quirk here where hunting means one very specific activity, and that is hunting with hounds. So that is part of the issue here. I think where you could certainly debate whether hunting... Sorry, see, I'm getting myself in a muddle now, aren't I? Whether pheasant shooting and partridge shooting is hunting or not. It's an odd thing because, as you say, if you book a 200 bird day, well, you can expect to shoot 200 birds, and the only thing you need to do is shoot, okay? And you need to be good at the shooting, but you know, that's what you need to do. You don't need to go and find those birds. You don't need to outsmart the birds. You don't need to understand the birds. You need to stand in your peg and shoot the birds. So I would say, by the way, that on a pheasant shooting day, a lot of hunting goes on, but it's done by the beaters.
Yeah.
It's the beaters who are hunting, really, because it's them that have to understand where the birds are going to be, how to work the birds, how to move the birds, how to, you know, all that stuff. The hunting on a shooting day is really done by beaters rather than guns.
It's a little bit like you go on a safari for trophy hunting. That's the tracker who does the hunting. And the actual client hunter is like, there, where, there, the elephant, yes, boom, right?
A bit like that. But what I would say is do not underestimate the skill involved in shooting driven pheasants.
For sure.
People have this idea that pheasants sort of lumber slowly over the horizon and any fool with a gun can shoot them. No, that is not the case. There is very considerable skill in shooting fast, high-driven pheasants. And if you ever watch people who are good at it, that's absolutely clear. There is very, very considerable skill in it. But to my mind, it's not a hunting skill. It's a shooting skill.
Hence, it's called shooting. So the name is correct.
Yeah, absolutely. And if you contrast it to something like deer stalking, let's say that I went out to shoot a deer tonight, I would have, which I can't do because of lockdown, so I'm not going to. But if I did, then I'd have to understand that deer. I'd need to think, right, where's it going to be? How am I going to approach it? How am I not going to be detected? That is hunting skill, okay? Which is not part of pheasant shooting, or certainly not part of driven pheasant or partridge shooting. So I wouldn't call it hunting. I like the term shooting to describe it, but I don't think that makes it any less of an activity. It just makes it a different one.
Yes. No, and that's for sure. You know, I'm more of an aiming at the points that are being attacked repeatedly by the opponents. And do you feel like there is a genuine moral concerns, or is it like business as usual, and this is just a change in business model?
Genuine moral concerns for who?
Oh, I mean, for the all people who are against the shooting, because obviously it's no secret that both grouse shooting and pheasant shooting is a subject for constant pressure, essentially to eliminate it.
Okay, I think there certainly are people who genuinely think that they are morally wrong activities. There's no doubt about that. And I think, I wouldn't dismiss that at all. I think there are people who've spent a great deal of time and effort thinking about these activities and have come to the conclusion they're morally wrong. Yes, they definitely exist. That is not all of the opponents of shooting. I don't know if it's most, but it is. There are certainly a significant number of people who genuinely and earnestly and in a well-reasoned way have come to the conclusion that they are morally wrong. There are other people who may think that their consequences are harmful, don't have a problem with the activity itself, but say the negative consequences mean that it should be banned. And there are other people for whom it is a way of pushing different political agendas.
Yeah.
But there certainly are people, no doubt about it, who just think that shooting birds is wrong. And I respect that. That's the conclusion they've come to after serious moral consideration. Well, fair enough.
Yeah, this is really something that interests me a lot, and I had many conversation on that, because then at the end of the day, it comes to really wanting to impose one's moral values on somebody else's, right? Because there's like, oh, it's immoral because you shoot those birds. Like, why it's immoral? Oh, because you remove them from the habitat, but these are introduced birds, they're not there, and but you shouldn't kill the sentient being, right? Like, yeah, what about this burger that you just had? And this is just a rabbit hole.
Would you like a short moral philosophy class here?
Yes, please.
Okay, right. Okay, so there are two. This may get rather dull. Warn me if it does. There are essentially two approaches to moral decision making. Okay, there are consequentialist approaches, which look at an action and they look at the consequences of that action, and they say the consequences make that right or wrong. Okay, so should I smack my child? Okay, well, what is the consequence of smacking my child going to be? If it's that my child grows up to be a good, well-behaved human being, then that is the right action. If the consequence is they grow up to be a swaggering bully, then it's the wrong action. So that's one approach, is to look at the consequence of an action. The second approach is what's called the deontological approach, which says some actions are just right and some are just wrong. And that's all there is to it. The consequence is irrelevant. So that your deontologist would say either it's just wrong to smack children, or no, it's fine to smack children. Now, how does this apply to your anti-shooting activist? Because I think there are essentially two types of anti-shooting activists. There are consequentialist anti-shooting activists who say the consequences of shooting are such that shooting is wrong and should not happen. Okay? And they would typically make environmental type arguments. There are other people who are deontological anti-shooting activists, and they say, no, killing animals is just wrong and you just shouldn't do it.
Yeah.
Okay? So you basically have two very different approaches to the issue, which you do with it. I mean, that is very classic, very basic moral philosophy, to sort of crystallize it like that. But those are your two types of anti-shooting activists, in my experience.
Yeah.
And your consequentialist activist, actually, that is somebody who you can kind of talk to and debate with, because you can discuss the consequences and you can make a case in terms of the consequences. The person who says killing birds is just wrong, well, where do you go from that in terms of discussion? I'm not saying that they are incorrect or that their argument's not valid, but it's a very difficult argument to engage with.
Yes, exactly. And this is what I found. And my view on this is that the consequentialist approach is more mature. This is just my I hear about this division first time from you right now, but I think it's more mature because it kind of takes the responsibility for what is happening. And even in the previous episodes, and for a long time, I'm extremely interested in wildlife conservation in Africa and trophy hunting and all that. And this is classic example, right? That you have all these arguments like, well, look, if you're not gonna go and shoot, buffalo or elephant or whatever or hunter is willing to shoot, then the land will be gone, the animals will be gone, it'll be gone, right?
Absolutely.
And this is
So, like, you interviewed Adam Hart.
I did.
The excellent Adam
I
Hart.
did.
Now, Adam Hart is a classic consequentialist in that he says, I don't really like people shooting these things, but I accept that the consequence of them shooting it is all this conservation that occurs, so therefore I support it. It's a classically consequentialist stance.
Exactly. And this is like another thing that you said, that people who don't have this stance, it's very hard to argue, because you're kind of hitting like a brick wall. It's like, I don't want anything bad happen to an elephant. That's it. And it's short-sighted. It's short-sighted. So
it is short-sighted. I think so. I think it is short-sighted, and and as you say, where do you go from that with these people who will just say, no, you must never kill animals.
Yeah, it's only after a while when they would find out, like, what you gonna do now, right? Where are you going? What you gonna do? Where you go from there?
Yeah, and you know what? You can love animals into extinction that way.
Yes. Precisely, and that's not unheard of statement. Like, no. I don't even remember when I read this, but someone said, like, I'd rather see those animals extinct than being hunted by these white assholes and something like that. And I'm sitting
sure.
Like, what did you just said?
Well, I'll give you another example. It must be a few weeks ago actually. I wrote an essay for a rewilding charity. They asked me to write an essay on rewilding and hunting and whether the two were incompatible. And, these kind of land use debates and stuff that I participate a lot in. And so I wrote an essay essentially saying, no, I don't think these things are incompatible at all. I think they are very compatible. And they had a lot of sort of comeback from that, from people saying, no, it's just morally unacceptable. Killing animals is just morally unacceptable. If it's just not a thing we can contemplate.
Yeah.
Where do you go from that?
That's it. And you're very nicely you're doing my job for me now here.
I'm trying to help out.
Yeah, you do. You're doing a great job, because you nicely change provide a segue or pivot into rewilding. And I cannot not mention that you are an author or godfather of wildly successful Hampshire hyenas project. I remember I was sitting with my daughter in the airport, and we were just going through Twitter, and I saw that, and I see like all the retweets and likes and everything. It's like, whoa, something is going on here. It's like people just jump on it.
Absolutely. Do you know the most unexpected Twitter success? I think that was. Just bizarre. It was Sunday evening, and I was just sort of feeling vaguely sort of tetchy and whimsical, and decided to put out this silly tweet saying something like, I can't even remember what I said now, that I was setting up the Hampshire hyena project, and that I was to reintroduce hyenas to Hampshire to help control badgers, and that I was looking for committee members who had no experience of Hampshire or hyenas.
Yep.
Which, to be honest, I thought might get sort of 15 chuckles on people on Twitter, and ended up in the Times. It was so successful.
Yeah.
I mean, it was absolutely bonkers. Thousands of likes, hundreds and hundreds of retweets on it. Yeah, it was extraordinary.
Yeah.
Extraordinary.
And obviously that was firmly mounted in reality, right? It was firmly mounted in some of the rewilding attempts, because it's a little bit like a discussion that we had earlier about the consequentialist and the other group. What was it called? The other group again? The ontological, right? And this is a little bit like that there are people who have this let's say pragmatic approach to rewilding and what it is and what it should be, and then you have this group who is like completely, like when you read this, you sometimes read about ideas of introducing bush elephant into North America, the North American plains to replace the extinct mastodons, and you go like, what the, like, who even?
Yeah. I mean, Hampshire Hyena Project actually was a quite specific spoof
Oh, okay.
of I mean, obviously, it spoke to the way a lot of people felt in general about rewilding, but it was a quite specific spoof of a project that somebody tried to launch to reintroduce lynx to Northumberland in the northeast of England.
Oh, okay.
And it was quite specifically said, dig that up, because that's really the way they went about it. Was, well, we're going to bring lynxes back, and you're all just going to have to deal with it. And none of us actually live in Northumberland. None of us know anything about Northumberland, and none of us have got any academic background in lynxes. But we're going to bring back lynxes to Northumberland.
Oh, wow.
It was dreadfully badly handled, and I think a lot of passionate rewilders look at that specific project as a case study in how not to do it, and will say that it has knocked back any chance of reintroducing lynx by decades, because it was so terribly badly handled. And they went through this dreadful series of meetings with farmers.
Wow. So that was, okay. That's interesting. I didn't know that, and probably most of the listeners didn't hear about that either. Please.
Well, so they wanted to reintroduce them to an area called Kielder in the Northumberland, in the northeast of England, where there are very large areas of commercial forestry, but also very large sheep farms. And they really just did it in the most appallingly arrogant, lazy fashion. And they had this sort of series of meetings with local sheep farmers where people raised concerns about lambs being predated by lynxes, and they said things like, well, actually the much bigger problem is just it is your husbandry, and actually if you address the problems with your husbandry, you'd have far fewer lamb losses. Which went down like a bucket of cold sick with the farmers. So that it was that specific project really that sort of inspired the Hampshire Hyena Project.
Wow.
Was the Lynx Trust UK's attempt to reintroduce lynx to Northumberland, which is now gone. I mean, the DEFRA, who are the relevant government ministry, basically said this isn't going to happen.
Oh, you know what? Now when you said it, I think I heard something about it, and there was some sort of a funding for that project, and then people who said that they're gonna fund that kind of withdrew from that. Was that this thing?
Yeah.
Oh, I heard about it. Yeah.
And it all just sort of fell apart, really.
But I didn't know they was so blatantly wrong. Like, I didn't have that background. Okay, I just heard that the people.
You know what's sad about it, I think, right? Really, is that actually, the more I think about it, the more I read about it, the more I come to the conclusion that the rewilding movement actually has some real insight, and it has some real value if you can get past silly ideas like, reintroducing lynxes on the grounds that if you're all just better looking after sheep, it'd be fine. If you can get past that kind of silliness, there is actually some real insight in the rewilding movement, and some real value to it. So I think it's kind of sad actually that it's become synonymous in the public imagination with these top-down, we're going to come and rewild you type approaches.
Yes. And I said it a few times already on the podcast that I was surprised at first to learn that rewilding is a controversial word, even it's a controversial term, because even on this podcast you were saying about pheasant release, and you say like, oh, there is a rough patch of the land that is great habitat, and now there is an incentive for farmer to keep it if they release a pheasant and so on. Like, that is a rewilding. That is kind of like keep wilding, let's say, isn't it? Right?
Yes.
That's exactly it.
Yeah. There is, and there is definitely an ability for a natural affinity there. Definitely. The problem is though, these things get lost in a whole series of wider debates and kind of tribal loyalties almost.
True.
And that's where it gets obscured. Which is a real shame, because there is valuable insight in the rewilding sort of approach, and the ecosystem regeneration approach to conservation has real insight, and actually is not naturally, I would say, antithetical to shooting and to hunting. I think there's a natural symbiosis there, which has got lost.
No doubt. I have no doubt. And here's an interesting thing that I observed, that when I talk to hunters or field sports people like yourself, but also here in Ireland with many members of the deer hunting organizations, they are fundamentally not against rewilding, and this is kind of in line with what my kind of hunch will tell me, that actually hunter would like to go into wilderness and have an opportunity to meet, not necessarily should, but to meet different animals, and boar and lynx and wolf and bear and all sorts of things. They're not against that, but then they're kind of like you mentioned, in a tribal way, pitted against let's call them animal. I call them animal loving crowd, right? But this is not accurate term. But let's say people who are not so keen on shooting and hunting, and they both kind of like they feel the need to be against each other. They have to disagree, and then everything falls apart.
Absolutely, and there is a strong kind of tribal sense to this. It's like, which gang are you in? Are you in the shooting gang or the rewilding gang? And there are polarizing figures in both of those camps who try and maintain that. So yeah, absolutely, that is a serious issue. But the two are not natural enemies. I agree with you. Shooting culture puts a very high premium on wildness. Yes. And the idea of the wild is a very strong and important draw for a lot of people who are involved in shooting. Yeah. So, I mean, put it this way, Tommy, do you know anybody who would rather shoot a tame deer in a park than a wild deer in a forest?
No.
I don't.
No, definitely.
No, because wildness is a desirable quality in quarry.
Exactly. Even if you see on the YouTube the video of deer being called in a park, and you have comments from hunters like, "Oh, it's bad to shoot the bull in a park. You don't shoot the deer in the park," and whatever. Because that's exactly what you do. What you're saying, that the hunters are value. This is why we do this, right? This is why we do to contact with nature.
Absolutely. Yes, but the problem, I think the problem arises partly because there's this idea that one thing is excluding the other. So in Scotland, it's like, well, we want to rewild the grouse moors, and then people who love grouse moors and care about grouse shooting are saying, well, so you want to get rid of our grouse moors, do you? And you end up with this sort of tribal clash, which people can't get past, because it's like, well, you're stopping us from rewilding, yeah, but you're trying to stop us from grouse shooting. And actually, there's plenty of space for everybody to do their thing. We just need to be more imaginative, more creative about how we think about land. And there's plenty of space for all of us. There's no doubt about that. And the other thing I would say is that actually the rewilding projects that have got off the ground in Scotland, so there are a really large-scale rewilding projects in the Highlands at places like Glenfeshie. Glenfeshie shot a tremendous number of deer to get their rewilding project off the ground. A tremendous number. I don't know, thousands, certainly, of deer were shot in Glenfeshie to get that rewilding project off the ground. So rewilding isn't going to happen without people with guns.
Yes.
It's as simple as that. So, unless we can all find a way to get along, well, rewilding is not going to happen.
Yeah, and this is interesting. How do you see this play out? Do you think that finally there will be some middle ground? Because even I see myself that I'm trying, even in this podcast, talked with people from let's say various ends of the spectrum. And sometimes I feel like, all I'm achieving is that, on both ends, people are like, well, decide, Tommy, what side you're in, Tommy, right? Are you for this? I was like, no, I'm actually not on either side. I'm just trying to, and it's hard. So how do you see this played out in the future?
I don't know. It's really interesting to see. I don't know who will win, or if we'll all compromise and meet somewhere in the middle, or what will happen. Rewilding is a very vigorous movement at the moment, and it's capturing a lot of attention, a lot of public imagination, And I think there is a lot of sound insight within it.
Yeah.
So it's going somewhere. But shooting retains a very powerful position in British society and in British land management, and I don't think it's going to cease to
Yeah.
exist.
Yeah.
My money is that there will be large-scale rewilding projects, but there will also continue to be large-scale shooting in the UK, and I think that actually there will be some exchange of ideas between the two.
Yeah. Yeah. Hopefully.
And yeah, there will be some kind of, we will get rewilded shoots who've used that kind of ecosystem restoration insight and the idea of minimal or no land management intervention as part of their model.
Yeah.
So I think actually there will be a transfer of ideas and knowledge between those two sectors, but they will both continue to exist.
Yeah.
One is not going to displace the other.
And my view is like that all the hunters and people involved in hunting or shooting, to use the terminology, should actually, this is what I kind of advocate, should actively engage with the rewilding people, if not for any other reason. Is like, if those big projects will go ahead, then potential, resources, natural resources, those hunters risking being locked out of those resources, and then management that will be inevitably required will again gonna end up with hiring sharpshooters or anything like that, rather than relying on the recreational hunters who can.
Absolutely, I think yeah, we'd be smart to engage. There's no doubt about that. We'd be wise to engage with those projects now, and get an understanding of them and build relationships and all of that stuff, because they're not going anywhere.
Yeah.
Those are going to be part of our landscape, and that movement is going to be part of the way people are thinking about ecology and think about the environment for a long time. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean bears and wolves and lynxes and all that stuff, but what it does mean is that kind of ecosystem restoration approach that says, actually, maybe we can serve better by doing less.
Yes.
Rather than constantly having management interventions. Maybe what we need to do is step away and do less. That is going to become a significant part of the way people think about conservation and land use and land non-management, as it were, in the UK and in Scotland, and we need to engage with that. No doubt about it.
Cool. Listen, Matt, I know that you're stuck for time, so just one last thing that I quickly want to touch on with you, and this is phasing out lead shots and shooting lead in shooting, and probably further down in fishing as well. What's your comments on the initiative? Because on one end there is an initiative going on and struggle in the EU, where Commission is trying to ban lead or put it on the list, restricted list. Most of the as far as I'm concerned, most of the hunting organizations from across the Europe are opposing that. Then in the UK, shooting organization done something that I thought is kind of smart, because they come up with this plan of voluntary phase out of lead shots, which I actually was surprising, especially to many people who are fighting that ban in the EU. But at the same time, I think it's kind of smart move. So what was the reception of that on the ground?
It was very mixed. So there are some people who think that shooting organisations have just done the most terrible, unspeakable, dreadful thing by saying they'd like to see lead go over the next 5 years, and are really, really angry about it. And certainly BASC, the British Association of Shooting and Conservation, who are the biggest shooting organisation in the UK, they took a lot of flack from members over that. There were a lot of very unhappy members. But there were also a lot of people who said, good. We needed some leadership on this. We needed a push on this. It's very clear. This is my stance. I'll not have any pretense about this. This is my stance. We needed some leadership on this. We needed to get on the front foot on an issue, okay? And to be able to say, no, we're dealing with this, because lead contamination from shot is an environmental problem. People are going to try and tell you it's not. It is. There's very clear evidence on this. There's strong scientific evidence about lead poisoning of birds from lead shot. So we needed to get on the front foot on this. And I think it was exactly the right thing to do, was to kind of take a lead and say, well, we're going to voluntarily phase this out over 5 years. That's completely sensible. It's not a ban.
Yeah.
It's a voluntary phase out. And that's absolutely the right thing to do, because, you know, there are people who love to shoot with old-fashioned guns that can only shoot lead.
Yeah.
Okay? Well, they can carry on, as long as the rest of us who shoot with modern guns that can shoot steel move over to shooting steel. Then let those people let those people who can only shoot lead, because the alternative is that in 5 or 10 years' time, lead will just be banned. It'll be flat banned, and then nobody can shoot lead, and people will be saying, well, what do I do with my granddad's old hammer gun now? Well, scrap it or hang it on the wall, because you certainly ain't going to shoot it. This is a very, very sensible move, in my opinion, that actually puts shooting into a much stronger position in the long term. But has not been universally popular.
I think that the other thing is that giving ourselves or shooting community this lead time, that also allows to mount enough, well, maybe pressure or maybe demand that will be heard by ammunition manufacturers. Because to me, the fact is that if we have as good as equivalents for lead shots, then there will be much less of the conversation. There are certain cases right now in this moment where lead shot, you know, it's not, can be replaced by steel or tungsten or anything else. But you know, that will change. I'm sure that will change, because especially when there's going to be demand and the pressure on the manufacturers, they keep, you know, developing and doing this stuff all the time anyway. So surely they'll start developing more of a replacements or equivalents of a lead ammunition that then could be used for high pheasant shooting, or, you know, will address the problems with the ricochet and stuff like that.
Absolutely, and it needed that push to focus minds on that issue. I don't believe that these guys cannot do this. I don't believe that cartridge manufacturers cannot manufacture cartridges which fire steel and are just as good.
Yeah.
Okay. You know, they will find ways to do it, but they needed that push to focus minds onto doing it. No doubt about it. And that's what these shooting organizations have done. You know, is they've given it that push. And frankly, they've decided not to defend something which was indefensible. Now, that's just good strategy. You don't defend things that are indefensible. That's just a waste of effort. It's a waste of resources. You know, and Basque and Consequentialist Alliance and National Gamekeepers Organization and whoever else could have spent the next 10 years fighting to keep lead shot, and they would have lost it anyway.
You know, I think that the fight really, like in my head, where I would place that fight goes not so much for stop using lead, but don't ban it completely. Because, you know, I'm fundamentally for freedoms. And if like you said, somebody have a gun, like a hammer gun for his grandfather was using, or some other thing, like, well, yeah, go ahead and go and shoot the duck with a lead shot. The problem is when you have, you know, thousands of people shooting lead shots over one body of water for, like, you know, last 50 years. That's a lot of damn lead in that body of water.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I completely agree with you, Tommy, that we need to be responsible as a community. We need to be responsible. And that means that where we can stop, we should stop. And if people can't, then they can't. And I understand that. So, for example, there's an issue about very small bore shotguns, okay? 410s and the like. For whatever technical reason, it's very difficult to provide non-lead ammunition for those, okay? Fair enough. So let's keep shooting lead through those for the moment, okay? If we stop shooting it through our 12 bores that can move to non-lead ammunition, that is a reasonable, sensible, responsible, pragmatic approach to the issue. It's not reasonable or sensible or pragmatic to just say, well, we're all just going to carry on shooting lead.
Yeah.
No, that's not sensible. But it is sensible to say, let's try and reduce it as far as we can so that those people who have to carry on using it are able to do so and have the minimum possible environmental impact.
Okay, Matt, listen, I think we're gonna be wrapping this up. Thanks again for your time and coming on the podcast.
Well, thank you for having me, Tony.
I think that I hope that a lot of listeners on both ends of the spectrum will kind of don't be so tribal about it and more focus of the, like in the top of the conversation, more focus on the outcome that is to be achieved rather than on the, here and there and there's them and us mentality, because that is really, really not getting us anywhere in the long run.
Yeah, and that's what we need, isn't it? We need, to move away from the kind of them and us mentality, as you say, and to look at what outcomes are we trying to produce and what do we have in common in terms of trying to produce those outcomes. Yeah.
Matt, thanks a lot. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you, Tommy. Nice speaking to you.